Touch on some of the policy adjustments that we've made in regards to the implementation of the new framework, as well as revisions to the program itself, just some minor updates so you're aware. Get a lot of questions about the proposed rule, and a sense that there's a lot of anticipation or desire to see the proposed rule to gain an understanding of what it's all about. I want to remind you all that on our website, the document that's listed at the top here under What's New is a fairly long document, but Appendix A of that document contains a real complete description of the content of the preliminary rule. That was first posted last September. It's been updated a couple times, and inside the cover of that document is a itemized list of the slight adjustments that we've made in that preliminary content from September. So there were some updates made in January, and there were some updates made in March. Those are very systematically presented, so if you read the document back in September, these 2 pages will bring you up to date on really some of the adjustments that have been made. So in regards to the proposed rule, we are having that proposed rule put through the clearance process. And of course, when it's through the clearance process, it will be published in the Federal Register. Bottom line, the general requirements call for, with some exceptions, all livestock moved interstate must be officially identified and accompanied by an interstate certificate of veterinary inspection or other movement documentation. There are exemptions by species. 2 exemptions that apply to all species straight across the board is in regards to the movement of livestock within a tribal nation. For example, if Navajo establishes their own traceability system, that tribal land covers, I believe, 3 states. They could actually cross a state border and not be considered an interstate movement. Also, for all livestock that move directly to a custom slaughter facility or exempt from this federal proposed rule. Within the proposed rule, we frequently reference a general standards document. The intent here is to put more of the specific details of data standards, some of the key ones, the numbering systems for animals, for example, in this external document. So as we expand data standards, we can update this document without going through a revision to the Code of Federal Regulation. Probably haven't clarified this in the past. We've made reference to livestock very generically. We have recently further defined what is covered in the regulation, and those are the species as listed: cattle, bison, cervids, equine, poultry, sheep and goats, and swine. Aquaculture is noted as they bring a National Aquatic Animal Health Plan forward. It's the intent to bring them into the list at a later date. We talk about official identification as one of the primary components of the regulation. It's important to understand that these official identifiers or methods of identification are defined by species, and while there's numerous methods of official identification, probably the one that's going to be used, continue to be used the most, is the official ear tag. And through the efforts of the working group, we've unified the definition of the ear tag so it's more readily, easily determined. If we want good enforcement compliance, we have to be able to look at a tag and very easily know if it's official or not. So, as this proposed rule gets put in place, all official identifiers after a certain date must have the U.S. shield and, of course, be imprinted with a nationally unique number, official number. Those official numbering systems are the National Uniform Ear Tagging System, commonly referred to as the Bright Tag, Animal Identification Number, the AIN. It's important to acknowledge that we are going to transition through this proposed rule to one version of the Animal Identification Number. Today there's 3 versions. They're all 15 digits, or characters. There's the manufacturer coded option and the USA prefixed option. Those will eventually be transitioned away from in regards to their acknowledgement as being official. They're in the CFR today, but we'll transition away from those. So in the future, 840 will be the only version of the AIN. And through our discussions over the last year, we are maintaining in the regulation that 840 is reserved for animals born in the USA. The other official numbering system is a location or flock-based numbering system, most commonly used in the Scrapie program. So official ear tag, very easy. U.S. Shield, and one of 3 nationally unique official animal numbering systems. The other real key component of the regulation is the use of ICVIs. In today's regulations, they are not defined. This regulation will define what previously has been generically or generally referred to as a certificate. We will define what information must be included as a minimum on the ICVI. We note by species when it's required, and we provide administrative requirements to the accredited veterinarians for their submission, which is going to be very important as we continue to implement the new framework. So real quickly, I want to review official ID by species. I think in the past we've covered cattle more specifically, and rightfully so, but I think it's appropriate just to give everybody here, since we have individuals from different sectors of the industry here, to give you a sense of how we're looking at official ID by species. For captive, and in many cases, as we've acknowledged along the way, that we're relying a lot on existing regulations where appropriate. So certainly for captive cervids, really no change. Official ID is defined currently in 9 CFR 77 under TB for captive cervids. Horses and equine. Today there's other than defining official ID for an EIA reactor, there's no official identification defined in the regulations. So we are defining official identification methods for equine, and they're pretty broad and all-encompassing. And we've worked with the equine industry to really provide definitions that are pretty much practiced today. Again, all of this information that you're seeing on the slides are in the document that I referenced earlier that's on our website, so I won't go through some of these slides in that much detail, but certainly acknowledging that on the equine side, all of these methods of identification are being defined as official. Poultry, we talk about a sealed and numbered leg band that's established through NPIP, and also acknowledge the use of group lot identification. Sheep and goats, we're totally relying on the current CFR 79, Part 79 for the administration of the Scrapie program. Really that's working well, and don't want to disrupt something that the industry supports as it is today. Also with swine, maintaining official ID definition as it's defined in CFR 7119. So what's left? The most significant change, as we've said along the way, is in the cattle sector. For cattle, official identification is an official ear tag and group lot ID when applicable. Very important to understand that official ID requirements are being phased in for different sectors of the population, and we'll go over that in some detail because it's very important. It's also important to note, not only for cattle and bison, but for all the species, throughout the regulation, it'll be clear that other identification methods may be used as agreed to by the shipping and receiving state or tribe, including brands, tattoos, breed registry certificates, and so on. We're defining what official ID is by species. Unlike the current regulation, there will be acknowledgement in the CFR that will require every state to accept all methods of official identification. And no one state can accept only a specific method of identification. No one state can require RFID ear tags, for example, or require something else. They must accept all methods of official ID as defined in the CFR. That's important. So as a producer, I can tag my calves, for example, at any age and know that those calves are good to go anywhere in the United States to meet the official ID requirement. And again, that's why we're trying to clearly define what an official ear tag is. And I know this is too small to read, so I'm going to walk through this because it lays out the approach we're using for the phase-in of official ID in cattle and bison. So when the rule is published, or the final rule is published, the exemptions for official ID of cattle and bison moving interstate would include the sexually intact cattle and bison 18 months of age and over. Dairy cattle of any age, cattle and bison of any age used for rodeo and recreation events, cattle and bison of any age used for shows and exhibitions. I'm going to talk a little bit about some temporary exemption, and this really defines the phase-in beef cattle under 18 months of age. Cattle and bison moved direct to slaughter, including through one approved livestock facility, for example, auction or market with the USDA approved back tag. In Denver, the Denver Forum, sponsored by USAHA and NIAA, we responded to the concern about requiring official ID for cattle moving direct to slaughter from a market, for example. So it was requested or recommended that we phase in the official ID for this sector of the industry. And this is the approach that's being taken to kind of make that part of the phase-in process, thinking that further down the road, the majority of these cattle would already be officially identified with an ear tag. Ongoing exemptions include, again, the statement about the two states or tribes. The officials from those jurisdictions may accept other methods of identification. Commuter herd with a commuter herd agreement. If cattle move from my premises and I have to go through part of a state, but I come back to my state, still part of my operation, really not an interstate movement. And then, of course, movements to a tagging site where those animals would be tagged prior to commingling with animals or cattle from other premises. So, going back to that phase-in of those two temporary, if you will, exemptions, the phase-in, part of the explanation in the preamble of the regulation will clearly define the assessment process that we've outlined, and we've worked really hard with the cattle industry, and we appreciate their cooperation and assistance in arriving at what I think everybody feels is an appropriate approach to how we evaluate the progress being made. So there will be an assessment period where we assess the progress being made of the final rule with the intent we don't want to go forward with those younger cattle in the system until the system is working well for the adult breeding animals, concerned about growing too fast. When we think things are working well, and we'll be in dialogue with the industry along the way, when that assessment process is started, we will go through a notice in the Federal Register informing everybody that we are starting the assessment and lay out the process more thoroughly. Part of the process will, of course, be to evaluate the tracing capabilities of the system. We're confident that what we're calling for early on will enhance traceability. We want to document that. And in so doing, that establishes a baseline. We pretty much know where we're at today. Further down the road, we can measure the effects of this regulation, and that helps us establish a baseline that we can measure progress from that point forward. An advisory group, that advisory group will include industry representatives from the sectors most directly affected by the inclusion of feeder cattle, if you will, into the official ID regulation. They will help us evaluate the effectiveness of the initial phase and offer recommendations regarding official identification requirements of beef cattle under 18 months of age. That's a very important part of the assessment phase. In addition, as part of the assessment, we'll be evaluating our level of compliance with official ID. And we're looking at 70%. We're not saying 70% is adequate for traceability, but it's an indication that we have more than doubled probably what we have at that point in time. It's an indication that the system has grown, and we want to make sure it's grown at least to this level before we do the assessment process. Through all the dialogue and feedback from the stakeholders, and certainly the advisory group, when an assessment has been determined that expansion of official identification requirements in cattle is viable, we will, or APHIS will, publish a notice of the assessment in the Federal Register, and that process will then provide an announcement of the date when those requirements would go into effect. No date specific. We want to just be prepared to go through this process, make sure everybody's on board, confident that what we're doing in the initial phase is working well, have industry support and guidance before we move into the inclusion of all cattle into the official ID requirement. So that's how we're going to transition into official identification in the cattle sector. Some other key points in the regulation. And it's been important along the way is the collection of ID at processing. At slaughter plants, all man-made ID must be removed at slaughter and correlated to the carcass through final inspection. That's part of an FSIS regulation today. We will have that part of an APHIS regulation as well, so we have the authority for this requirement directly. In addition, all official ID must be removed at the rendering facilities and made available to APHIS. This is one of the more recent adjustments that have been added to the proposed rule. I'm not going to go through these, getting a little short on time, but again, on the ICVI side, there are exemptions. Bottom line, this is basically saying cattle moving direct to slaughter are exempt from ICVIs. Again, moving from one state and coming back into the state like we exempt official ID. Commuter herds along with official ID. We're allowing the states and tribes to accept other methods of movement documentation other than on ICVI at their discretion, except for the breeding animals, those animals, as it's stated here, that are under 18 months. We're wanting to maintain the ICVI requirement for the adult breeding animals. They're exempt. Move to an approved livestock facility. For example, if I live in Nebraska, I could move my animals to a market in Kansas without an ICVI. If those cattle leave Kansas from the sale, then an ICVI would be required. And of course, animals moving direct to a vet clinic and back would not require an ICVI. One of the other key points in the transition to the regulation has been the acknowledgement of recording official ID numbers. From the very beginning when we looked at this, especially for the feeder cattle issue, we realized that that would be a big obstacle, recording all of those numbers of large volumes of feeder cattle coming through the sale. So those were exempt from recording, but we wanted to make sure that we're more clear on this. So I think some of the newer text maybe helps clarify that original intent. Official ID numbers of cattle and bison must be recorded on the ICVI or other movement documentation unless the cattle and bison are sexually intact cattle or bison under 18 months of age, or steers or spayed heifers, except sexually intact dairy cattle or cattle and bison used for rodeo, exhibition, recreation purposes. So we're exempting the recording of official ID basically for feeder cattle, and we are not requiring the recording of official IDs on dairy steers, would be the interpretation of this. I want to acknowledge traceability performance standards because, gosh, Keith and others that were on the working group, we spend not weeks but months on coming up with some really good indicators of performance to measure, because we want this framework to be outcome-based. We still have that objective in mind. However, we're adjusting the implementation of those performance standards somewhat compared to what we were explaining last September. So the concepts of the performance standards that the working group established, those 4 tracing capabilities, and I'm not going to go into them because that's a lengthy explanation in themselves, will be acknowledged in the preamble of the regulation. It was pointed out to us that we could not put those in an external document because they in turn could require additional activities or requirements of the state for the movement of livestock. In that we're not ready to specifically say what timelines those performance standards must be met in, we've elected to reserve a placeholder for those performance standards and publish those through a rulemaking process at a later date. We worked with the working group and we came up with some recommendations that are in the current documentation with the understanding that that was an estimate of what we think should be put in for achieving those activities. We are not ready to say hard and fast that this is what they would be because we really need to measure those down the road after we've implemented this regulation to see the results. And that's part of the evaluation process that we'll go through in the assessment process to measure tracing capability, and at that time those baselines then can be considered for the final establishment of those performance standards. So they'll be referenced in the preamble of the regulation, but not actually published in the regulation itself. A couple points on policy. We talk about the NUS tag, National Uniform Ear Tagging System, as we commonly refer to as the bright tag. We've talked about making those tags more readily available. The states now have the prerogative of making those tags available direct to a producer. Prior to just recently, all of those tags were administered through accredited veterinarians specific for disease control programs or for the use of preparing animals for interstate movement. So that option is available to states today. I'm sure they're working out the administrative details if they're making that option available, so I'm not going to say they're readily available because that's at the discretion of the state animal health officials. Part of the change that's also been made is that these tags could also have the state abbreviation as the first two characters. Prior to that, they were all numeric. In regards to the tags with the state postal abbreviation, those tags will be administered by the state or tribe. Veterinary services will continue to contract for the numeric coded tags through the warehouse and make those available at no charge to the states at their request, the ABIC in those states. So the approved, the plan is, for example, if a state wants to use the postal abbreviation for these metal bright tags, we will have a list of approved tag companies that are authorized to print the NUS tag, and the state can work directly with that manufacturer to obtain those tags. At this point in time, we're not planning to inventory both versions. The other programmatic adjustment that we've made in the animal tracking systems is the standards for location ID. First, it's important to acknowledge that the Animal Disease Traceability Program does not require a state or tribe to administer location identifiers. However, we have continued to make the premises ID number available. Will continue to be made available through the PIN allocator. The standard remains the 7-character numeric field. We are also adding an option there that a state can request that the first 2 letters be their state abbreviations, kind of putting more of a reflection that this is truly a number administered by the states. If they want to go there, that option will be made available mid-year. In the framework, very important to the feedback that we heard was more flexibility, that if a state elects to use another method of identifying locations, provide that as an option. So we maintain PIN as the number that's allocated by the premises allocator that veterinary services maintains, but it's really administered to the states and tribes that request that PIN. If a state does their own allocation or assignment of numbers locally, totally in their system, those numbers are referred to as LIDs. The first 2 characters are the state, Minnesota, MN, plus one of the formats that we've agreed to would be the standard, 6 or 8. Bill, I believe you're using MN plus 6. Correct. So Minnesota is a good example of, they've done their location identifiers for many years. The new framework will acknowledge that those LIDs are the equivalent of a PIN for all practical purposes. Again, to respond to some of the concern about the federal government having too much information, this is a way to acknowledge that those LIDs are administered locally. The only piece of information we'll have is the location identifier itself. No producer information, name, contact, phone information whatsoever. That's all maintained at the state level.